Good afternoon. Welcome to the culmination of International Museums Day at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. We'll go suitably global for the culmination, and I'll share with you some thoughts under this title of Global Trends in the Science Museum Field, which is what I often seem to be talking about these days as contributions to conferences, because I think it's important to well, so often we're eyes down, knees deep in the details of our operations, making them efficient and effective, that the large picture does matter. And I know you're not all involved in science museums, but I hope that the reflection of how purpose has been evolving within one branch of the museum field, generally in the sciences, will be useful to you all. The first layer of this consideration is to give ourselves the due of saying that the museum profession belongs as a bona fide profession alongside all other sectors which shape the progress of society. It's not often that this is a point made in museum talks. We tend to sort of dive into our field, and we know that we're a mixture of government-operated, non-profit, sometimes for-profit organizations, and sometimes a hybrid of those. But each of these organizations, in this alphabetical order, each have or should have their own sense of purpose and contribution to the greater good. And in that regard, museums are no different. And we collect ourselves as a profession, and I just think that we should give ourselves that status when we describe our ambition of greater influence on the needs of society and the environment. By "and affiliates," I'm collecting into one line things like aquariums and zoos and botanical gardens and all the other places that have collections of other kinds that don't necessarily fit the museum definition, but are part of that picture. This one hopefully covers who's in the theater today, because within that highlighted line of the museum and affiliates sector that shapes society as a whole blend of institutional types, of which maybe this is not a complete listing, and I highlighted science technology centers on this slide because where I was last giving that talk, that was the audience, but let's imagine they're all highlighted for this purpose, because I'm sure that you span that range, maybe not every case. There's no botanical gardens here, right? No aquariums, but a lot of you have fish, you do, right? A lot of us have live animals, and so, it's almost this whole list. We could say at the Museum of Natural Sciences that whether here or at Prairie Ridge, and somewhere in this building, we probably have elements of all of these types of museums, which could be museums in their own right, standing alone, being just what the line item says. But one of the trends in the museum field is the blurring of the boundaries of museum types to become a hybrid, to do what you need to do, to pull from the toolkit in order to deal with the purpose that you've declared for yourself. So as we look into science museums, and this is a prelude to the next couple of slides about how I feel the purpose of science museums and natural history and natural science museums has evolved, I think an influential point in the last century was the prediction by the then famous British astronomer Fred Hoyle in 1948, as you see, that anticipated that once we go outside of our Earth and take a photograph of it for the first time, that'll unleash new thinking as important as any in history. And that would be correct, because if you were born already at that time, you'll know that the early 70s unleashed the environmental movement, and to see our planet lonely in space, we still don't know of anywhere else in the universe where life exists. And as Carl Sagan said, that little pale blue dot, when seen from the outer limits of our own Milky Way galaxy and beyond, that's all we are, and yet this and everything else on the surface of planet Earth is there. And we would also realize and get a little concerned about this wafer-thin atmosphere that is our protective envelope, and the fact that it's 70% blue, 30% green, and we can't really see any signs of humanity from space. And so there we are. So what has that done for human philosophy? Well, I think a great deal. Let me just build this slide, because whether we're talking about museums of natural history or museums of natural science, and the next one will be about science museums and science centers, in my view, they've each undergone a three-generational evolution, not in the nature of the activity that engages you as an experience when you come into these places, but in terms of purpose, which I think is a more fundamental way to look at the evolution of change within the museum types. You could do a slide like this. I wouldn't be an expert at it, but in art museums, just look at the preoccupation recently with repatriation of art pieces, and of the whole sort of anguish about bringing back to Jewish families art stolen during the Nazi era, or in this country and in Australia, New Zealand, and other countries with indigenous people, the repatriation of precious remains that those peoples don't believe should be stored in museums quite the way they have been. But that's just a digression to say that each museum type has been undergoing its own sense of evolution. But when it comes to museums of natural history and natural science, if you were sort of looking at this slide back in pre-80s, it would likely be the case that all the museums you might visit, without going around the world to remind us about where these are, they're in the hundreds and they're mostly in capital cities. Those big museums of natural science and natural history, most of them are called natural history then, are basically about collecting, research, and interpreting the evidence of ancient life and saying that's it. And generally the storyline stopped with the so-called ascent of man, and human evolution was touched maybe, but the storyline of time stopped as we were getting to the interesting bit in terms of the impact of one species over all others. In the second generation stage, one can say that, borrowing somewhat from the next slide's evolutionary path, that of science museums, that the world of digital everything entered the world of these museums and allowed access to collections and started to incorporate more interactive approaches than the static approach that had been under glass for all time. And then in the third generation, perhaps reflecting this institution's purpose, but again a blend of other museum types, is that the time frame of focus has moved from just looking back at the past and stopping before we got to the current day, in incorporating more interactive approaches and online access to collections, and now being predominantly about illuminating the interdependency that we have with the Earth and this vital moment that only we can solve, other than by the natural processes that are at work still, and we saw that with the Gulf of Mexico, with the natural recovery on top of our own human cleanup of the Gulf oil spill. Nature is incredible, but it needs helping hands who often deal with what we have brought as an influence, and in some cases, if we're consuming resources faster than they can ever be reproduced in nature, then the course is not reversible. But that's sort of the picture as it comes to those museums. I'll give you two other quotes that prelude the Science Center picture of that evolution. A colleague of mine, a physicist at the University of Toronto, Ursula Franklin, in a book called Planet Under Stress in 1990, published by the Royal Society of Canada, had this prophetic quote, and it's a prelude to what we would now call citizen science, that the task of the future, as she said, is to build understanding, knowledge among and between citizens and scientists, so that the distinction between the two groups vanishes, and so that potentially we're able to solve our problems together. A more famous quote would come from Carl Sagan, whose series is being continued by Neil deGrasse Tyson on Cosmos, who said that science, I maintain, is an absolutely essential tool for any society, not science is engaged only by its practitioners, but science understood and embraced by the entire community, he felt. So this leads us to consider what has been the population growth of we humans, which is down the strip of this slide. The billions refer to human population, and the years represent the year in which that next billion threshold was reached, and the number of years required to go to the next billion growth. So it's slowed, and it seems to have stabilized at about every 10 to 15 years, we're adding 1 billion people to the human population. And that's a pretty big number. And just for context, 7 billion plus going to 8 billion is 3 or 4 million more than there are years in Earth history. Because the Earth and the solar system are 4.5 billion years old, 4.65, based on the age of meteorites and the age of rocks we've obtained from the moon and the rocks we can date from the oldest parts of the Earth's surface. So all of those tell us about 4.5 billion years, and yet human population today, not in all time, but the number of people living today is more than that by quite a margin. So what this means is that all this impact of the human presence, particularly since the Industrial Revolution, and during the period which geologists are now considering a need to rename to the Anthropocene or the Anthropocene, meaning the epoch of the human. No other geologic time period is so named after one species, which has become so predominant. So that's the case underway in the world geologic community. What it means is that symbolically and literally, the Earth is now somewhat in the human hand, or the human brain, or the human mind, whichever you prefer, and we are obliged to sort of go fast forward on innovating society to respond to that responsibility, and also to be good stewards of the environment, where possible reversing the damage we've done, or conserving the resources that remain if they're finite, which many are, at least within any conceivable human time frame. It also means that there's a new era of this second phrase, life deep, life wide, lifelong learning, a phrase which I first heard a couple of years ago from the National Science Foundation. We're all familiar with lifelong learning, the idea that learning doesn't stop at graduation, that it's a lifelong process, but the power of these three terms is that it makes one think that as you kind of walk through life, that all the time you're walking in three axes of learning. One is, right now, each of us could say, without moving another step and without looking around us, that we're thinking more deeply about what we just heard, but we're also looking around us to see who's with us, and all these axes of depth and breadth are taken with us on the forward journey through life. So for me, that's a pretty powerful and useful concept. The wording on this got a bit warped by PowerPoint translation, but as I move to the next step of this, the emeritus scholar of the Smithsonian, who passed away in 2005, his last paper that was published came out in an ICOM newsletter, actually, the management series, in 2006, called Beyond Management is the missing word, Making Museums Matter. You may remember his famous book called Making Museums Matter, published in 2002, which still remains one of the great sort of influences on consciousness in the museum field. Not that all of us have been listening, but he said that this sort of in-our-face quote, he said, "The awkward fact remains that for a variety of reasons the museum field has never really agreed, and until recently has scarcely even sought to agree on some standard by which the relative worthiness of institutions might be measured." So that's a pretty sort of heavy guilt trip on the museum field. It's saying that we exist, we open every day, but we really don't know what our larger purpose and definition is. Well, I think that's a pretty weighty responsibility. So I think one of the signs or one of the ways we can describe the current museum field is that it perhaps is in one of three states of mood. If we say that a virtuous direction for the field is to evolve our conscience, to use the expression, to go from nice to necessary, so that we're indispensable, not just pleasant, that we actually have a purpose as a sector that help shape society, like all the others that I listed on the first slide. There are, and maybe this is classically exemplified by a museum that has a very large endowment that doesn't really have to think too much about its larger purpose. It is well endowed, but has been not obliged to think of its greater value. And I distinguish those things. So that's one category. Many museums are in this middle box of trying to go on a journey of increasing their sense of importance and interest to the greater good. And I would say, wouldn't it be great if the majority of museums, and I think this is going to have a financial consequence in the future, because young people who are tomorrow's donors, for example, and governments who are stringent on their expenditure are going to have to pick and choose between those organizations that deliver wholeheartedly on being useful to the needs of society. And it's up to us to be a part of that conversation and help frame what should be seen as those needs of society, because it's a very complex equation. So this leads to a number of words, if you will, that are in front of us these days in the museum field. Centrally on this list at the top is the word relevant. And I think each of us has a sort of a journey of consciousness about when these words like this come into our thinking. For me, the word relevant, which is a widely used word, it became very fashionable in the 60s to talk about social causes and to be relevant to them, but it hadn't really zoomed into the museum field's terminology very much until the 80s. And I can remember distinctly, as I stand here, I was on the advisory panel for the Getty Leadership Institute in Berkeley, and Phil Nolan, who was the then sort of professor to the Leadership Institute for Getty, asked me as an advisor. He gave me a short amount of notice. He said, "Emlyn, I'd like you to talk about relevance at lunchtime today." And I hurried to the 4-inch thick Merriam-Webster dictionary at the library of the faculty club where I was speaking, and I hadn't realized until that moment that the definition of relevant is, anybody want to give it a whirl? What does every dictionary pretty much say is the definition of relevancy or relevant? Important to a particular person or group, that's very close. Relating to the matter at hand, or to the matters at hand is what it says, which only helps you some of the distance, because then you have to say, what are the matters at hand? And so one of the earliest helping hands to that definition, you may have read the prescient works of a guy called John Cotton Dana at the Newark Museum, who there's books being published on his writings by the American Association of Museums. But he said in 1909, which was just when the American Alliance of Museums was beginning, he said, learn what the community needs and fit the museum to those needs, is what he said, which is a pretty sort of direct equation sense of relevance. Learn what the community needs and fit the museum to those needs. 100 years later, Stephen Weil would say making museums matter, and pointing out that the awkward fact remains that we still don't agree on some standard by which the relative worthiness of museums should be gauged. So that's what relevance is about. Bifocal, and this is just the Emlyn Koster choice of words that I think are important, but bifocal comes from the work of McKinsey, the consultants, who say that any organization should keep in focus, like bifocal glasses. You know, you need to look and see that carpet in focus in the same focus as I can see the farthest point in this lower floor. Organizations need to keep both of those distances in focus. Interdependent is that we don't do anything alone. Multidisciplinary is that we can't do it by ourselves. Collective impact is the same thing. It's the jargon in front of pretty much everything you read in philanthropy these days, is that the problems we want to help make headway on can only be solved by collective impact. Holistic intentionality comes from the work of Randy Korn, who's a consultant in Alexandria, Virginia, who's written about this in a paper with this title, saying that an institution like a museum has to sort of like the gearbox in a car, operate synergistically with all parts connected to everything else. You must have one total sense. You can't have one part operating at variance or at a separate purpose from another. Form follows function is a term borrowed from architecture, where buildings got to be very pragmatic about they need to have a shape and a form that delivers on the purpose that they have. So a hospital doesn't look the same as a university, doesn't look the same as a school, doesn't look the same as a museum, etc. So form follows function, I think, is a powerful concept that reminds us that before we embark on something, we better have a clear sense of what the end is, and then make the means fit the end. It's sort of a very practical way of thinking, but it tends to head you in a useful and economic direction. Return on investments is a bit of a business jargon and still controversial somewhat within the museum field, but the idea is that all of us in our museums have had public and private sector forces in various amounts over time, make what we have now possible. It's kind of daunting to think of this place, 1879, and I've never done the arithmetic, but it wouldn't be very difficult to estimate it, that literally the hundreds of millions of dollars that have been poured into this place. I mean, it's about 20 a year, so that's the case since 2012. Before then, it was maybe more like, half that amount per decade, and the budget was tiny for many decades. But if you add it all up, I mean, it may well be approaching $1 billion over 1 1/3 centuries, which, call it what you want, but I think that obliges us to have a sense of return on the investment. What have all these people done, and what's our obligation to grow and reflect the best output that we can with all those inputs? And then going back to the first slide, I said every sector doing its part. This slide is geared to that presentation I gave a couple of weeks ago internationally, but it was about the theme of building a community through science. But imagine if you're in history or art, building a community through fill in the blank. My point is that relevance should drive you to determine, to declare, to pursue which aspects of fill in the blank your surrounding region needs most. Well, this is about science. And then secondly, in the same breath almost, you don't have the luxury of doing one of these and then the other. It's a continuous journey of evolving conscience to make clear what your distinctive external value is and to attract to it stakeholders and collaborators. I think along the way we ought to make clear that we're about a discipline that most people don't have a very clear understanding of what makes it work, right up to what's a theory and what's a fact, and what's a hypothesis, and how do we know, and how do we collect data, and how do we keep on changing our mind, and how that's okay, and how science proceeds and progresses, and so on. Since the word STEM, or the acronym, is so popular in the science realm these days, science, technology, engineering, and math, there are members of the Raleigh community who actually prefer using Sam Houston's definition of STEM, that it's strategies to engage minds, which I think is a more useful definition of, or application of the synonym, of the acronym than 4 disciplines, which I think we get a little overly excited about sometimes, as being a panacea to all things that we need. And an organization, having done those first 3 things, should continuously, through new staffing, new approaches, new professional development, should continuously deepen and broaden its expertise so that we're being as smart as we can about maximizing our contribution within the realm of our sector. And then do what we're doing today, which is learn wide, deep, and long to integrate new insights into the way we think and to share these innovations as we do pretty liberally within the museum field at conferences and so on. So for a science museum, we should pick, any one of a number of areas that would make us relevant. And this is no particular order, and it certainly isn't complete. But just to speak briefly to each of these, it may be that, and I wouldn't suggest we do any one of these, but it may be that one purpose, and it's becoming a growing one for science museums, is to enable the citizen involvement. But much more classic is to partner with some grades of the educational system, often young grades, elementary and middle school grades for most museums. Missing in the public's sense of what I think is important is people tend not to grasp the time frame in which we're living and how much time precedes us and our place in space and so on. To promote human and environmental health would seem to be pretty important. Mentoring a sense of interdependency with nature, that we increasingly detach from our natural world. That's an important one for this institution. Exploring the origins and uses and limits of natural resources. There's a whole separate talk that could be given on the notion of peak oil or peak coal. The fact is that the first hole we drilled into the Earth's crust to get oil is only about 160 years ago. We've already used about half of all the fossil fuels that geologic processes put into the Earth's crust, which means there's half left, and we're going through it faster and faster. So energy sources in the future are going to have to solve that problem. And fracking and fracturing rock to get natural gas and to enhance the resources from rock which was formerly not exploitable or explorable or whatever the other verb you might pick, that's only extended this issue. I mean, it's lengthened the time frame. But peak oil is still peak oil. Peak coal is still peak coal. We had a talk here last fall about peak soil. We rely on soil to grow things on, and we're paving a lot of it over and we're polluting a lot of it. And in California, a lot of it's too dry to be productive right now. So peak soil, this peak phenomenon is pretty profound. Natural hazards and mitigation processes. Just look at the times each year when we get jolted by the world's news, whether it's earthquake or tsunami or nuclear accident or landslides or forest fires or whatever it may be, storms, floods, drought, that we need to make headway with. Sustainability is a huge one. What does it mean? Where are we going? And any museum, not necessarily through exhibits and programs, but through conversation, might want to help to illuminate whatever issues are important to that region through conversation, not necessarily through exhibits and things that cost $500 to $1,000 per square foot and that exist for maybe 5 or 10 years, but conversations which you can devise last month and have next month, and that probably do a major job at helping to illuminate public understanding about an issue. We're doing more and more of that here in terms of science cafes and conversations, for example, about coastal issues, which are being co-planned with the Coastal Studies Institute at University of North Carolina down by the coast. So somebody asked me this morning, where did I come from to get here? These are the 3 museums of which I've had the honor to be at the helm. A new natural history museum at the top near Calgary, Alberta, which tells the history of the life on Earth through the fossil record, but which stopped as humans were evolving, and I had a problem with that, and I couldn't change their minds, so I said, thank you. It's truth. I've written about that. In the middle is the Ontario Science Centre in Toronto, which at the time was about opening minds to science and technology, Canada's largest science centre. And in the bottom is Liberty Science Centre, which closed for 22 months and added 109 million, reinvented itself from being a classic science center with a tagline of where science equals fun into being what we called a globally minded resource for living, learning, and working in and caring for the New York, New Jersey region. And I had a couple of moving calls from colleagues just on the weekend because the September the 11th Memorial Museum has just opened, and I am honored to be credited in the actual end part of that museum, which is come in from some pretty heavy criticism already, but right at the end there's a gallery devoted to something positive out of all that, which is called Project Rebirth, and it's the film about time-lapse photography and people putting their lives back together again and actually being able to move on. And I helped with a non-profit called Project Rebirth. You can Google it under that name, Project Rebirth. So we were right opposite Ground Zero. It's a mile to across the Hudson, right behind Ellis Island on the morning of September the 11th. So I would then write about the therapeutic role of museums in the aftermath of catastrophes. And it's something we all should consider. I'll just digress there for a moment because this happens seldom, but when it happens, it's huge. So the thinking that we did in the months coming after September the 11th in 2001 shaped, for example, it would appear, after the Boston Marathon bombing, those museums opened for different purposes and dropped their admission fees and became places, sanctuaries for people just to collect their stresses and their needs. And a lot of this happened in the first time where I was in 2001. So this place, on this sunny day with this fisheye lens shot, shows the building sort of in its entirety. I think what I put on here is that we're hosting ASDEC, the Association of Science Technology Centers conference this fall, October 18th to 21st. So if you want to sink your teeth into the world of science centers big time, then register for that conference. You can go to astc.org and get the program. If you come, you'll be joining some 1,700 delegates from 45 countries who are coming to this conference in October. It's a big deal. But there's the museum, and the way we see it, I said this in intro remarks upstairs this morning, is that in yellow across the building as we go from one end opposite the State House to this end, we ask the questions, what do we know with a North Carolina lens? How do we know with a global research lens? In between what's happening now, and increasingly, how can I participate? Which I'm using the Prairie Ridge Classroom, LEED certified, to illustrate that piece. That's our satellite facility 6 miles away near the Museum of Art, 45 acres. But these buildings are called different things. I talked a bit about this morning to some of you. When this building opened, all of this in 2012 on Earth Day, it sort of was loudly pronounced, quite justifiably, as being the new Nature Research Center. But after we sort of digested the big picture, this is, after all, the newest wing of a two-wing museum that has the other end, which was variously called the main museum or the main building, and sometimes even the old museum, which was not acceptable, because it's still perfectly good, thank you very much. And so the research lab out at Prairie Ridge is where the majority of our collections are, both those in alcohol and those frozen, and those which can't be stored in the 2 levels below the Nature Exploration Center, the NEC, which is what we have decided to call the opening wing and the Daily Planet. The SECU Daily Planet is this space here. And between is the Betsy M. Bennett, my predecessor, who made possible in leadership terms and fundraising terms both of those buildings in 22 years. A pretty incredible legacy. And that's named. So I mentioned a few terms earlier on, and as I move towards the end of this, let me just give you what can be thoroughly boring terms, right? Most of us would yawn when we heard efficiency and effectiveness, but I actually think they're important terms to distinguish, and an organization ignores them at its peril. And I'm known to my staff here to often use the metaphor of a car on a journey, because if any vehicle is heading towards a particular direction, that one, as opposed to that one, or that one, or that one, it doesn't get very far towards its destination, which is a matter of the end, without having pretty good means, which brings us back to what's underneath the hood of the engine of the car, which must run reliably, have high miles per gallon, not be subject to breakdowns, and if it does, we know how to fix it pretty quickly, and it works holistically and smoothly. So efficiency is what's under the hood, doing things right. It's the means. Without it, you can't get anywhere. Effectiveness, and this is not my definition, this is Peter Drucker who said this 40 years ago, effectiveness is doing the right things as opposed to doing things right, and that's about the ends, and that's the value of the journey and the check stops and the strategy towards achieving higher states of purpose for the organization. The other set of equations that I feel are true after my museum experience of being at the helm of 3 institutions before is that relevance, a term I defined earlier, is actually made up of a sort of a dynamic duo between every institution needing to find its balance point between being useful and being popular. And those two things aren't the same thing. You hope they are, and you want them to be complementary, and it's an education of the audience to get them to be seen that way. But some science centers veered pretty seriously into popularity and had their missions drift accordingly, particularly if they had IMAX theaters and they just decided to show every film under the sun daytime in their theater and draw people in and not really care about where the mission was traveling. So usefulness and popularity is a sweet spot reality for every museum to come to terms with, but it's not static, and that's where sustainability comes in, particularly in science. You can't stand still. Science is moving, and so must the Science Museum. So relevance plus renewal is key in order to have a business model sustainability for the organization. Just a few notes on those. What it adds up to in a return on the investment ROI sense is that valuable to think about a so-called impact funnel, which, if you will, could be the front door of the museum, any museum, which over time, through lifelong, life deep, life-wide learning, you'd hope that the mind of those who you attract, of all ages and backgrounds, that your experiences help to move people's minds from these words of insight to action. Otherwise, the world's not going to be a different place. Museums, you know, I said at this conference the other week that if we were all sitting here and this was a presentation and we were all working in a hospital, we'd say, how do we cause our patients to be even more comfortable and have a reliable recovery from what brought them here? If we were a school, we'd say, how do we make school even more productive at preparing students for the challenges that they'll face and the opportunities they have? You know, I'm not going to fill in the same answer for museums, but we should be equally thoughtful about how we consider our purpose and what our return on the investment is. So inside this place, you're in this room right now. This was opening night, or it was opening night because so far that globe has only been illuminated that way on opening night, but we hope to bring that back later this year in time for the ASDEC conference. So this is a pretty amazing place, and reconstruction of North Carolina's environments happen in the Nature Exploration Center. The exhibits move more high-tech. In this building, that's about DNA on the top floor of the NRC. And this whale right behind you here might superficially look like the whales that are suspended in the Nature Exploration Center, but the whole purpose of that specimen of a right whale, which was killed when it was pregnant, the fetus is still inside at this end, that tells the story of a person's research. Remember, this is how we know what we know, how we know that shipping speeds coming out of East Coast ports, if they were to be slowed from 20 knots to 6 knots or thereabouts, the force of a ship hitting a big marine mammal like that would no longer be sufficient to kill it. It might bruise it but not kill it. And that was the whale on which the research was done to ascertain those speeds. So that's why that's there in the context of it. But investigate labs, children outside, science cafes, interviewing luminaries like E.O. Wilson. That's all part of the what happens here. And so our special events, like we're holding the second one of these this fall. And this is the showcase for students with disabilities We hadn't thought about doing this before, but we have a person on staff who is particularly mindful of how this museum can open its doors to so-called special populations. And these are two of the resources we had at this event. And it was a very poignant day, and we're doing it again in October. And of course, I'm accenting the public side of this institution, but behind all this educational front line is a very highly skilled and successful research team who are making new discoveries about the natural world. Here's Dr. Lindsay Zano, who's on this stage right here, talking about her new predatory dinosaur discovery that filled in a 30 million year gap between carnivores leading up to T-Rex in the late Cretaceous, about 70 to 100 million years ago. And up in the upper left is a new mammal looking a bit like a raccoon that had not been identified as a new mammal, had been seen but not identified and figured out, lives in the high altitudes of the northern Andes. And both of these discoveries were made in collaboration with other museums. In one case, the Field Museum in Chicago, and the other one, the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History. So that's a sort of a wee insight into that side of it. And every time we do that, maybe the public side of this building gets us to the White House, like a couple of weeks ago, to receive the National Medal for Outstanding Community Service. But outstanding research is also what this place does, and it's an equal point of pride, and it gives us the sort of authority, the intellectual authority, to have the underpinnings to be a museum, and that the SEAT's story got tremendous publicity around the world, and that's just a few of the bits of news coverage. And lastly, I said this a few minutes ago about conversations happening. So this is actually slides from when I was in New Jersey. This is Hurricane Sandy, although it would no longer be a hurricane after it came up the East Coast. Ironically, or maybe not ironically, I had 2 years before hosted a conference with the Dutch water experts on what New York and New Jersey should do in order to prepare for the inevitable storm surge from an inevitable storm that made an inevitable hit on the New York-New Jersey boundary, and it would happen 2 years later. And this was the surge as it started to flow over into Jersey City and New York. And by that evening, the surge would be as high as the top of those lampposts. I remember the Weather Channel guy standing there in the morning and saying, well, tonight it could be halfway up. Well, in the dark and with spring tides, that is the highest tides in the lunar cycle, and with an onshore wind, the storm surge reached the top of those light standards. So no wonder there was $60 billion of damage. And whether or not this is going to happen again, or whether there's going to be surge barriers. And that was the morning shot after the devastation on the Jersey Shore, with boardwalks ripped out and houses gone, and complete loss of infrastructure and roads and rail. And this was part of that $60 billion tag. One storm, 12 hours. And it wasn't even a hurricane, it was a superstorm, just underneath 75 miles an hour. But the storm surge was huge, because the coastline between New Jersey and Long Island is a right angle, and it was always known that if a cyclone comes up the coast and the right-hand side of the storm with the onshore winds hits the Verrazano Bridge, which is pretty much what it did, and that's combined with high tide, which it was, then you've got that amount of storm surge, even with a sub-hurricane force storm. So imagine what it would be if it was a force 3 or a force 5. And part of the education is that storms like that happen in different parts of the world in the mid-latitudes, and they're called different things, but they're all the same thing. So to learn from one is to learn on behalf of all. And moving towards the closure here. So 2 months ago exactly, it's the 19th of May today, isn't it? 2 months ago today in Belgium, the Science Center World Summit as it has every 3 years for the last 6 years, declared some particular directions of the field going forward. To be even better about engaging with local communities. Remember I said 1909, learn what the community needs and fit the museum to those needs. We're still saying it. Number 2, build awareness of the contributions of science to sustainable global. I've used that word a couple of times. It's a combo of local and global, that they're inseparable. Attract the attention of decision makers in the media to what we're doing. 4, leverage our position as trusted resources. We know that museums get tested and people trust us, so we ought to be able to leverage that position even more than we do, is what the declaration said. Promote understanding of the formal and informal conundrum, the terms that surround the learning that we're involved in. 6th, bridge the public to the world of research, which we do a lot of here. And 7, share your expertise, which is what we're doing today, to facilitate global progress. So before I end with a Gandhi quote, and this is going back, I put this in just last night because of 9/11 and my revisited consciousness about that morning and the fact that we were a place of therapeutic assistance to the 700 New Jerseyans who lost their lives that day. I was profoundly affected then, and I saw this slide again in my collection the other night, and I decided I would include it because this fund made some very thoughtful comments about today's children. And it doesn't just take 9/11. I would suggest that any number of things that are affecting the psychology of children today are in need of our better understanding. So this is a bit of a different facet of thinking for the museum field, to think about what's going on in the heads of our visitors before we even have them come in our museums. And you may have glanced at this already, but I think it's a pretty useful list. I'm not sure what we do about it other than be aware that the minds of our children often are filled with what's going on in the world, and it's pretty confusing out there. Knowing the facts, what's happening, why, and what are the trends. Helping them to develop opinions, using knowledge for ethics-based judgments. Questioning generalizations and understanding differences, very important. Living with uncertainty. The facts, opinions, and distinctions should not eliminate our fears or enable us to predict the future, but uncertainty must not demobilize us, it says. So that was 2001 after New York, and I promised you Mahatma Gandhi's phrase that museums need to be about the change we'd like to see in the world. Full circle on relevance. Be about the change you want to see in the world. So those are my thoughts about global trends in the museum, science museum world, but I think you could translate that into other sectors of the museum's business. Happy to answer any questions or respond to any points of discussion. Kimberly's got a microphone. Yes, please.
Where does the team here at Natural Sciences, where do you see yourselves growing and evolving in the next 5 years?
Well, we're trying to figure that out right now. But one of the journeys is to make this phenomenal content accessible to more audiences. So my little window into students with disabilities, we learned in that symposium last October that 13% of North Carolina children, it could be the same in any state, I'm sure, give or take, 13% of North Carolina's children have some physical or mental disability. So suddenly, if we're going to focus, as we're trying to, on that audience, not all those numbers, but by influence through others who care for them and parents who felt a sense of uplift that day that their children suddenly felt, they may have a future like adults there could tell them they do. That's a new audience. We're also trying to reach in to the pockets which are abundant in North Carolina, so-called at-risk, underserved, disadvantaged, whatever you call them. Because even though a museum is free, it doesn't create an evenness of the population. So we have to work at that. We're using new technologies, to help the visitor experience here. Handheld technologies for those who are blind, that's just being pioneered here. New conversational vehicles. You know, like I mentioned, for science cafes have become immensely popular. They didn't exist, then they were one a month, now they're 4 times a month every Thursday, and now we have teen science cafes on the first Friday of every month. So new links between content and audience. Also trying to influence, you know, those who support us, both public and private sector, to understand the greater significance of all this, and to show in another way that museums like this can have a tremendous economic impact. The conference that we're hosting next fall, it's not our estimate, the Convention Bureau says that 1.9 million will be spent in Raleigh in 3 or 4 days after people have spent a fortune getting here by airfares. So that's just local impact. So that fills hotels and restaurants and bars and buses and rickshaws and tips and all the rest of it. So there's many dimensions. But we're actually, right now, we're coming to terms with what is the new mission statement for this place, which has sat understandably over all this expansion to a point where nobody can actually remember what it says. So we're still at, you know, in some respects at square one with this. We're going back through that cycle of reflection and saying, so what is it? To use the American Alliance of Museums term, which I put into the discussion paper, which now, as of yesterday, 104 staff have voted on, between 7 candidates. We're reviewing it tomorrow's management team meeting. There are 7 candidates of mission statements, and there's quite a distinction between the more popular and the less popular, but I've asked that everybody not vote until they've understood the discussion that's behind it. But one of the points that comes from the American Alliance of Museums is that a mission statement of a museum should be its, quote, beating heart, which is a good way of trying to express, you know, what it is that you are trying to arrive at. It's a very delicate, important choice of words, not to be confused with a tagline, not to be confused with vision, which is an expression of the more advanced state of the enterprise, but what is it in an enduring way that describes your raison d'etre, your reason for being, your beating heart, that's going to stand the test of a good chunk of time. But we haven't, this place has not had the chance to do that with expansion upon expansion, so now's the time to do that.
Thank you. Just to tack on to that, a more kind of tailored and specific question about broadening your scope in terms of Latino populations. A lot of what we're seeing is traveling exhibits come in English and Spanish these days, and I didn't know what the mantra is here about trying to address those populations.
We certainly would like to. I wish there were more exhibits that we were thrilled about that are on the circuit that we could rent. You know, we're all reliant, aren't we, on a good supply of great traveling exhibitions that we can afford. And they're important choices because they change more often than we can change the core galleries. So whatever we choose and advertise is saying something about our institutional intent that's said more loudly, because we tend to pump money behind what's temporary. So the films we show, the traveling exhibits we bring in, are all important, loud choices about purpose. So we've had some bilingual exhibits, haven't we, Roy, in the past? We've had some bilingual, few, 1, 2, 0. They don't exist very commonly. What did I just hear? There's I just came back from this conference on the Asia-Pacific Rim, and for a very progressive museum, I haven't seen it yet, but I want to see it. It's called The Mind, and it's in Manila, the Philippines. Cost $27 million, it opened last year, and all their exhibits are trilingual. But it's about the mind, and it's a really provocative, fresh approach to a museum in Manila. Any other points? So, yes.
What would you say is your single greatest challenge that you're facing now with the institution overall, with meeting your mission and your goals, and how are you addressing it?
Well, it would be trite to say not making progress fast enough, but that, you know, that has to be sorted out for what do I mean there. You know, I think there's tremendous greater opportunity for this institution, as there is with every museum, but particularly large ones that have had tremendous recent investments, to be more to more people, which is why I was accenting new ways of making links between content and audience. So I think that's a never-ending quest, but it all takes time, doesn't it, to take an idea into action. But sometimes things can also happen very quickly, and sometimes one person on staff can have a brilliant idea which can be transformative. And we've had some examples of that, and I've alluded to some here. We're trying to identify, actually, in our goal process, what are the ingredients, the proactive ingredients of being as useful as we can to the field. I mean, that's an important journey. That's one of 7 journeys we've expressed for the journey of our car, if you will. We're trying to, as I said just now to this question, we're trying to define what sort of car we're on, because that's another instructive journey as a metaphor. Are we about energy efficiency or style or look or speed? I mean, different cars are made for different purposes. Different museums are made for different purposes. So, who we are, what makes us tick, and where exactly are we going and why, and with what metrics and for whom. Those are all very big, taxing questions, but I guess I'll flick back to my sort of answer to your question by saying, a lot of museums don't actually move very much at all. They sort of turn over, if you will. The engine's turning over and they're not actually traveling to a next destination. And I think those are the ones that I put in that red box on the end of that slide that said they're sitting pretty with a big endowment and they don't have to move. And maybe that's fine for them, but I don't think the world's going to be a better place if every museum just was in idle. And museums of science and natural science have a particular context and urgency, I think, to do as much as they can. So that's, you ask a large question, but that's kind of facets of a large answer to it. Right. But, it's like I said at the end on the leadership and strategy, you've got to make headway with this stuff. So Kimberly, thanks very much.